So maybe we can start. Hello and welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to our workshop. My name is Andrea Kina. I'm a project expert here at ESPON EGTC. So bear with me, this is my first in-person workshop after the pandemic, so ever since I started in ESPON as well. Today we'll be exploring more in depth the results of the ESPON flagship project, well, one of them, territorial impacts of COVID-19 and policy answers in European regions and cities. We are happy to host such distinguished guests to discuss how and if the social cohesion has been enhanced or what we can learn so far from the pandemic. We'll have here today the following speakers presenting the policymaker perspective. Mrs. Luisa Petrazzini, representing the Lombardy region in Italy, and also ESPON Monitoring Committee member. Mrs. Pilar Diaz, Mayor of Esplugues de Llobregat and Vice President of Diputació de Barcelona, but she will be only on video. She could not join in person, sadly. Presenting the project results, we'll have ESPON researchers, Mr. Sébastien Bourdin, Professor, EM Normandy Business School in France, and Mr. Mihail Aiva, Assistant Lecturer, Department of Geography, Alexandru Ioan Cuza University in Iași, Romania. He will be joining remotely. We also have Ms. Marine Godron, Coordinators, Territories Team for the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, or CEMR, and also Mr. Pietro Reviglio, Policy Advisor at Eurocities. So without any delay, I'm passing the floor to Mr. Sébastien Bourdin, who will also be moderating today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So yes, we're going to talk about an ESPON project, and the final report will be out soon, in July. So basically, we were a lot of universities and institutions that were involved in this project. And we come from a lot of different disciplines: urban planning, economics, geography, and also we involved organizations in this project to make our results more impactful. So basically, the idea of this project was threefold. First, it was to provide a first territorial evidence on the social impacts and effects on the COVID-19 at the regional level and at infra-regional level. We also wanted to analyze the spread of the COVID-19 and how the different lockdowns and so on and so forth has changed the spread of the COVID-19 and how different regions were impacted differently across Europe. And finally, another aspect of this project was to analyze the local policy answers to this COVID-19, and more specifically, we focused on social responses to this COVID-19 pandemic. So first of all, I just would like to talk about the two main policy issues that we wanted to address. The first one is how the pandemic and subsequent lockdown measures have affected poverty, social inequalities, and social inclusion in European Union regions. And the second one was to address the question of how the local policy answers was designed, implemented, and to understand the extent to which they were effective to address the question of the social exclusion and social inequalities during the pandemic. So first of all, the first part of the project was to analyze the geography of the outbreak. We collected a lot of data at the regional and infra-regional level, and basically what we can say with this chart is that, as we all know, the countries were definitely affected very differently concerning the different waves and the different parts of Europe. And a first chart that we wanted to share with you is the number of cases per 10,000 inhabitants in the major region in Europe. So the idea was to understand if there were some like a spatial heterogeneity of the COVID-19 pandemic. And to do so, we split into different regions the Europe. So we define the British Islands, the East Central, the North Europe, and so on and so forth. And we, as we can see, these different parts of Europe was affected differently by the pandemic. We decided also to split our sample comparing the more dense areas versus the rural areas. We also look at the border regions versus the coastal and intermediate regions. And again, what we can see is that there is a special heterogeneity of the impact of the COVID-19 on across Europe. Another aspect that we would like to address is to have a better understanding of the spread of the COVID-19 across Europe. And we collected weekly data from the beginning of the pandemic until the end of 2021. And we try to understand what were the factors that can explain this spread of the COVID-19 across Europe. So I'm not going into detail, but I invite you to read our report that will be out in July about the determinants and the factors that can explain this COVID-19 spread. We also ran country analyses in order to have a better understanding of the spatial diffusion of the COVID-19. And we look at specifically the differences between intermediate region, predominantly urban or rural regions. What is important here is to say that what we can say here is that the second wave was definitely the most hardest one wave, and more globally, it affects all the regions. At the beginning of the pandemic, we look at different data. We look at the density of cases, we look at the hospitalization, we look at the density of death, we look at the excess mortality. All of these indicators have their own limits, and we identified all the limits of these different indicators. But what we can say is that whatever the indicator we take into account, we observe the same patterns regarding the different waves. We also decided to map the share of persons that was diagnosed with a disease of COVID-19 and who died from it. And the idea of this map was to reflect the capacity of the health services to tackle the pandemic. And basically, for the first wave, as you can see, the Western Europe and Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, and England and UK more specifically were not very well prepared, and they were maybe overconfident toward their health system. They were also underestimating this new virus, so they were not prepared, and the consequence is that they were hit more hard. But for the second and third wave, what we can clearly see is that for the Western countries, there was more and a better preparation for the Western countries, maybe also because money was put on the table to build capacity for healthcare system. but for the European and Central Eastern countries, mostly the Eastern countries, they were hit harder, and it was difficult for them to manage the waves because of the lack of infrastructures and medical staff. Again, different charts. We also analyzed the country response measures and how these country response measures has affected the way the COVID-19 was spreading out across Europe. So this was basically the first part of the report. The second part of this project was to analyze the socio-economic consequences of the pandemic. And yes, we ran also country analysis and pan-European analysis. Here are different figures about the number of people who received the social benefits and pension before and after the pandemic. And regarding the different countries, we have different evolution. And it's not, the topic here is not to compare between different topics, because the way they distribute the social benefits and social pensions is very different between countries. But we would like to try, we try to have a better understanding of how the pandemic has affected the beneficiaries of the social pensions. We also look at the unemployment. And what we can say is that overall, we observed an increase of the unemployment by 12% compared to the pre-COVID pandemic, the pre-COVID regime. And more specifically, Baltic states and Czechia have been hit very hard, something like 40% increase in terms of unemployment. And in these countries, they experience a lot of job losses. And as it was mentioned by Stefano, in Italy, it was completely different because of a ban of dismissing employees. And it's a unique measure in Europe. And this ban has expired in July 2021, for large companies, and in October 2021 for SMEs. But it was effective to avoid any job losses. And in France, we had not the similar measure, but we had the whatever it takes of Emmanuel Macron, and so that companies were not tempted to fire employees. But again, we can clearly see a country effect and a geography of this evolution of unemployment. Here is a map about at risk of poverty, and again, when we look at the at risk of poverty, overall, when we look at the figures, the at risk of poverty was very stable when we compare before the pandemic and during the pandemic. But again, when we compare within countries and between countries, there were a lot of inequalities. And what we can say also is that youth was hit harder by the pandemic, and they were facing financial insecurity, and they were hit harder in terms of mental health problems, so they had to face a lot of problems. And here it's another map about the deprivation index that we calculated at the infra-regional level. And again, we can see a strong country effect with countries that were less hit, like France, Italy, Romania, Poland, and countries that were hit harder, like the Great Britain. And finally, for this second part of the report, we tried to make like a classification, a typology of the regions across Europe. And the idea was to analyze and to classify the different regions, the regions that were hit harder and that had difficulties in terms of unemployment versus the regions that were hit less and that has experienced more or less unemployment. And at the end of this report, we propose different typologies that reflect the geography of the pandemic. So I'm not going through into details, but basically, as we can see, there is a clearly geography of the impact of the pandemic, and more specifically when we look at the social consequences. And finally, the last but not least part of the report consists in examining the policy responses for tackling the socio-economic effect of the COVID-19. So to do so, we selected 14 case studies across Europe, included outermost regions like Mayotte, Azores, Islands, and Réunion. And the idea was to make desk analysis and to interview stakeholders that are involved in the territorial development. We interview elected officials, we interview companies, we interview associations and organizations, and so on and so forth. We did something like more than 300 interviews across Europe. And the idea was to analyze the proactive measures that was implemented at the local level, and we look at specifically the just, green, and smart transition measures. So again, I'm not going into details, but what we can observe is that more than a half of the measures that was taken by the elected officials at the local level was taken regarding the just transition. So meaning that most of these policy answers was trying to address the social consequences of the pandemic. And it's good news because when we look at the previous results that I presented, it was effective because when we look at the deprivation index and the at risk of poverty index, it was relatively stable when we compare to the pre-COVID regime. We identified different types of policies regarding the just policy topic, again with the green topic and again with the smart topic. I'm not going into detail because just after my presentation, I will leave the floor to three persons that will explain more deeply what was the local policy answers that was taken at the local level. And finally, we share the results and the analysis within a workshop that took place 3 weeks ago. And the idea was to share with the stakeholders and the steering committee and the organizations the policy recommendations that we would like to address. So we propose governance recommendation, policy recommendation, territorial recommendation, and finally financial recommendations. So it's just like a teaser. I'm not going into detail, and I will let you read the ESPON report that will be out in July. So what I propose is to move to the first presentation by Mihail Eva, and he will talk about the main conclusion of the case study of Iași County in Romania, and he will talk about the impacts of COVID-19 and the policy answers that has been done. And we will take all the questions at the end of this session. So thank you very much for your attention. And now I leave the floor to Mihail. Do you hear her, Mihail? Yes, good.
Hello, thank you, Sebastian. As you already detailed, may I share the PowerPoint or will be you sharing it?
That's a good question. You share it?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Perfect. Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, perfect.
Good.
Okay, so as you already detailed the context within which the case study has been conducted, I'm going to enter directly into the details of our work. We basically followed the three main objectives. First, to assess the impact of the pandemic. Second, to gather all that has been done to deal with the pandemic at the local level, especially those policies that could be labeled proactive. And third, we try to assess whether the crisis, and this is the most important, has also been a window of opportunity for local authorities to promote just, green, and smart policies. In other words, we assessed whether the local stakeholders have done more than reacting to, have done or have not done more than reacting to urgent issues and needs. Can you, oh, this is a little bit too fast. The main characteristics of the area, I will start with some economic features. We are dealing with a leading regional center in Romania. However, at the EU level, this region, this county is a lagging one with about 1/3 of its GDP per capita. However, the economic structure is dominated by tertiary activities, especially commerce, but with a growing IT and CE sector. And also with a significant automotive industry in the manufacture sector. From a demographic standpoint, next slide. We are talking about a county of about 1 million inhabitants, and the core city is a little bit has a little bit more than 300,000 inhabitants. But the striking feature of this area is not only the high share of rural population, but especially the really high disparities between urban and rural areas, as you can see on the right. Actually, it might be the highest rural-urban disparities in the EU. But on the contrary, from a demographic structure perspective, the county is dominated by adult and active population, which is a good thing. And this is a consequence of its economic attractivity, especially of its core city, and positive migration rates. Actually, it is one of the fewest counties in Romania with growth of the population. Here is a map of the county. We are not going to enter into the detail. What we can see is the Iași city is very close to EU border with the Republic of Moldova. Perhaps some of you might remember the city because the ESPON conference was held here 4 years ago. Next. The methodological approach has been undertaken in 2 steps. First, we conducted desk research. We basically, in this step, we gathered all that has been done by local stakeholders to deal with the pandemic, from online sources, official websites, local media, also social media, basically all that could have been gathered. However, of course, not all that we can find online is accurate. Most of the time is either inaccurate, either incomplete. So in a second step, we conducted a series of semi-structured interviews online and by phone with the aim of validating what we found online, but also with the aim of gaining an in-depth understanding of what has been done, who has initiated the policies, who hasn't been involved, with what purpose, and so on. The 11 stakeholders we have interviewed are belonging to different sectors, most of them to public administration, but to others also. Yeah, next. Before discussing the policies, let's take a look at the impact of the pandemic on various sectors and especially on economic side, because measures are usually taken as a response to the impact. Here is the impact on employment, actually on unemployment. And to put this into perspective, of course, unemployment rates have grown during the year 2020, but we should put this into perspective and see that 3 years before the pandemic, unemployment rates in Iași County and Romania also were significantly decreasing. So the growth of unemployment during the first wave of the pandemic was basically insignificant compared to the decrease of the last 3 years before the pandemic. But if we look at a cross-sectoral analysis, we might see some interesting facts. First, there was a growth of entrepreneurship, which might be surprising, but which is actually in line with some findings from United States. So during 2020, the number of firms and companies grew actually. But in terms of employment and turnover, the number of companies grew for all sectors, irrespective of the sector. But there were differences and significant differences when it comes to turnover and when it comes to employment. Of course, tourism and restaurants were most affected, and IT and CM, commerce and construction grew. Next. Here is some impact on the mortality levels. Basically, we have, again, average of the previous 3 years. With yellow, we have the EU average, with green, Iași County, and with orange, Romania. What we can see is the first wave basically didn't exist in Iași County. Actually, it existed, but the consequences on mortality were very low. On excess mortality were very low. But as the time passed, we have seen a bigger impact on mortality levels in Romania and Eastern European countries in general, and a lower impact at the EU level. Next. This is, of course, could be explained by many factors, including vaccination rates, for which Romania and Bulgaria stands the last places in the EU. Next. I will not enter into the detail on the impact on cultural events, museum visitation, and tourism. This will be found in the report, because I understood that the time is constraining us a little bit. It was basically the same as everywhere, with some very small variations. The most important thing, what did local authorities, what did local stakeholders do? And from this point of view, we found that the most of the measures have been taken in the area of just transition, and with almost no measure in the area of green transition. Of course, there are some policies to promote green transition in Iași cities, but they were not a consequence of the pandemic. On the contrary, there are quite a few initiatives in the area of smart transition, but most of them are small-scale initiatives and projects. I will enter into details on 2 examples, which one might say that they are the most representatives. First, the Social Emergency Center that has been created immediately after the first lockdown. It has been created at the initiative of NGOs, as in many places in Europe. Next. Basically, it delivers what any emergency center delivers, by psychological support, material assistance for homeless people, people suffering from domestic violence, and so on. But also, this is very interesting, particular for this part, for Romania and for Iași, it also delivered medical equipment even for hospitals, because hospitals were unable to buy due to bureaucratic stuffs during the first lockdown, and the NGOs and private companies were able to buy on the free market those medical stuffs, especially for ventilation-related activities for hospitals. So there were private money and NGOs money that were invested, including in medical equipment for hospitals during the first wave. Next. Who created this? Who could be, the initiative belonged to civil society, of course, but they received strong support from private companies. I mean, financial support. And next, also some support from public authorities, but not financial. This social emergency center functioned for about 2 years, so it was closed in February 2021, but interesting, 1 year later, it was quickly reactivated. Basically, it was reactivated in only 1 day, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine to provide support for refugees. Basically, now it is doing almost the same stuff, but for helping Ukrainian refugees. Interestingly, this social emergency center has been created for the first time during the pandemic, so it did not exist before the pandemic. Next. Another example, the second one, which I will present a little bit in detail, is the creation of a business-to-consumer platform called Territorial to promote local agricultural products. As the first example, it has also been created at the initiative of civil society, although this time is an NGO created by researchers. And it is also a direct consequence of the lockdown during the first wave of the pandemic. It has been funded by the City Hall, and it consists basically in a platform to promote local food producers from rural areas, poor rural areas around Iași city. During the first year of the pandemic, it gathered around 40 local producers from Iași County, and interestingly, during the second year, it grew and extended at the regional level. In the meantime, which is interesting, the government also created a business-to-consumer platform for the same purpose, but the government platform was not a success. It was basically closed after some time. So these platforms, at least in our case, it worked better at local and regional level and not so at the national level. Next. Other examples, these were not the only examples of proactive measures taken. Stakeholders, NGOs, and municipality also did proceed to increase digitalization of public services. Basically, from this point of view, the pandemic acted as a catalyst of digitalization. It also changed some strategies. Actually, when strategies were updated, now they include a specific strategic direction for digitalization, for tourism, for cultural activities, for other areas also. Details of these initiatives, who they belong to, why they were implemented, could be found in the report. Next. So some lessons to be learned. The first lessons is that the best examples have been emerged in a bottom-up way. So they did not come up from the top down. And even more importantly, they emerge as a consequence of civil society initiatives. Although all best examples are examples of cross-sectoral collaboration after the initiative. That is, civil society has been either supported by private companies or by public authorities to implement and basically deliver their idea. Another conclusion, there is an overwhelming predominance of just and smart transition initiatives with almost total neglect of green transition initiatives. At one point, I thought that this might be a characteristic of Eastern Europe, but actually it turns out that there are case studies in other Eastern European countries that have significant and an important number of green transition initiatives. So this is a local particularity. We might say that the pandemic acted as a catalyst for modernizing the administration, but not so as a window of opportunity, because the initiatives that have been taken and implemented locally are small scale for the moment. So their impact is really limited, and we might wait a little bit to see if in the future we are able or not to take this crisis as a window of opportunity. But in the meantime, there are other two crises that have hit the region, especially the energy crisis, which have been indicated by private companies to be the real crisis and not the pandemic. Some policy recommendation that emerge after discussing with private companies, civil society representatives, and so on. First, to promote digitalization by investing not only in digital infrastructure, but also in education and training, which is even more important. and with a special focus on elders, with a special focus basically on justness. A second policy recommendation, which proved to be significant during the pandemic, but is not related to the pandemic, is to enforce law in the area of equipment stocks for emergency situations. And in the area of governance recommendation, civil society raised the problem of building among public servants not only digital skills, but also management skills, which it seems they lack, not all of them, but in a significant proportion, and management skills that could help them navigate in complex, multi-sector, multi-level governance structures. And most importantly, we do not have, or we might introduce quality management indicators in public administrations to track progress. Progress at this moment is not tracked. So if it's not tracked, you cannot intervene to adjust the governance quality. From a territorial point of view, the most pressing problem is rural-urban disparities, and solutions to decrease them are hard to find, but everything that strengthens territorial collaboration, like business-to-consumer platforms for rural agricultural products to be sold in the city, like promoting entrepreneurial skills among rural population, could be tried as a solution. And in fact, it is at the moment, but on a very, very small scale. We still need to promote participatory budgeting and to dedicate financial resources to multi-stakeholder bottom-up initiative, because they proved to be very innovative and successful during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. So I leave the floor now to Luisa Pedrazzini for a presentation about the Lombardy region.
It works, yes, it works. Many thanks, Sebastian. Hello, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to present some reflection on the policy response of Lombardy that was probably the most affected area in the first wave of the pandemic 29. And thanks to Andreas Gina that helped me to do this. Okay, it works. So just some brief information about the area. Probably Milan and the region is quite known in Europe, is the most developed in Italy. I think that the spatial framework of this region is very important to understand how happened and why happened here for the first time in Europe, probably. It's a very densely populated area, more than 10 million inhabitants, and in the metropolitan region of Milan, the density is up to 7,000 inhabitants per square kilometers. But at the same time, in few 40 kilometers, the densities decrease dramatically, up to 2.5 person per square kilometers. In the Alps, Alps are very close to the metropolitan areas. And this means a very, very contrasted region. It is the economic capital of Italy. The first activity is still manufacturing, like many other European regions, particularly in Germany or in France. A range of economic sector, important trade, finance, fashion, and the most developed in Italy and one of the most in Europe. We have more than 800,000 businesses. GDP is higher compared to the European average, 39, you can see the picture, about 40,000 euro per inhabitants. So it is ranked in the first powerful region in Europe. Okay. So again, on a few information on the pre-pandemic, more than 4 million employed, about 20% of the national employment, 15% in the high-level sector and higher education qualification with academic degrees, PhD, and so on. The incidence rate of all young people 40.8%, and the risk of poverty 15.7%. And then the impact of the COVID on the region. As probably already know, the first wave affected very, very strongly this area, the metropolitan area of Milan, that includes different provinces. Bergamo, Lodi, Piacenza, that is a sort of line from the north to the south to the Emilia-Romagna, that is another region affected. And as Lombardy, Emilia-Romagna is one of the strongest region in Italy. So the Lombardy was the Italian epicenter of the contagion, and it was very dramatic, the beginning of the pandemic in this region, the severity of disease and the negative outcomes in terms of mortality rate was the highest in the city, and the most affected were Bergamo, Cremona, Lodi, and area with the high income, as I already shown. Sorry. Yeah. Other kind of impact. I mean, for me, it's quite interesting. This very interesting. This is not only valid for Lombardy or for the metropolitan regions. It's very valid for metropolitan regions. At the same time, we have Piazza Duomo totally empty, the city totally empty, but increasing biodiversity and wilderness. Nature entered in the city. And this means something, and this was an indicator that has to be taken in some way in account for the future, for new policy, for orientation of also for spatial plan, for town and country planning, I mean planning policy. Decrease in flight passenger, decrease in traffic and mobility, dramatic decrease. Lombardy is the first airports. The three main airports of Lombardy are the main attractor of goods and passengers, a decrease of 70%. We pass from about 50 million passengers for the three main airports to 12 million passengers. On the other hand, the two sides of the pandemic. On the other side, improvement in quality, in air quality, decreased pollution, decreased traffic, and so on. And this is not a little point for a metropolitan area, crowded metropolitan area. So, as you can see and you can imagine, in a region such strong for the economic aspect, losing of foreign sales, lose of 10,000 jobs in fashion and commerce linked to the fashion. impacting strong and dramatic impact on labor market, unemployment very important in young people and people from abroad that came to the metropolitan area, a decrease of 46,000 jobs among under 35, so young. Okay. What have been the policy response to the pandemic in the area? There are two main levels. At top level, that means at the national level, that are in some way quite similar to many other areas in Europe. Support that are mainly grants and economic supports by the national government and by the regional government to enterprises, to single citizens, to firms, and so on, to the labor market, mainly aimed to support these employees, and very, very strong effort by the government. The Piano Nazionale di Ripresa e Resilienza, that is part of the recovery plan, sorry, that is oriented and reoriented to give specific measures to support the economy, but also to help citizen and family, the most part also to family. But on the other hand, also from local policy, strongly rethinking to the regional health system in Lombardy, particularly. The Lombardy health system was more centralized. People went directly to the hospital when have some problems. And so a very important rethinking structure of health system organization. Improvement of broadband and ultra broadband. In Milan, I remember there was anyone totally empty, but people that were working under the ground to expand, to improve the broadband network. Probably we in the metropolitan area we lose left working place because of the possibility of to do smart working, the smart working explosion of smart working. Improvement on cycle paths and green areas. This is absolutely a priority of the municipality of Milan. The improvement of individual mobility, eco-friendly mobility. And in this, there is also an interesting project of the metropolitan area that is named Forestami. Already started before the pandemic, that is focused on the implementation of urban tree planting that increased, and it was also very increased after the pandemic, during and after the pandemic. Food solidarity disbursement and activity. So, I mean, this part are policy and project from the bottom, from the local government and from the people. In Italy, there is a strong structure of solidarity on not governative organization, and they acted very, very well in the moment of the crisis, and later collaborating with the local government, and more innovative form of cultural events. I don't mean singing in the balcony. I mean concert in open space, in the street, and so on. And they organize many events to socialize, to improve public and sociality on the air.
Yes.
So at the end, looking forward a policy recommendation. My colleague from ESPON put the list on financial recommendation, governance, territorial-wide. I add something. And here you can find the recommendation are, first of all, the approach, the compressive approach is needed. And as was already said this morning by the economist Mazzucato, break the silos, but this has to be done very in practice by projects, by concrete projects. So inclusion of research. I don't want to read the list. I just want to say what I added to this. Social recommendation, strengthening the network of ONG and voluntary association, improving hybrid form of socialness and solidarity, improving social consciousness of climate change effect. We have seen before wilderness that come into the city, and this is an important signal also to face climate change. And we know that the pandemic is an effect of climate change. And health recommendation, improving territorial local garrison for health structure and services, a more decentralized and close to citizen health center. And then after 2020, just yesterday, this was Piazza Duomo, 100 and more than 100,000 people. I don't know what will be the effect. I hope not too bad.
Thank you very much for your insight. Very interesting, because definitely Lombardy was one of the regions that was hit harder, and yes, very interesting to get the feedback from the people that were living there. So I leave the floor to Marine Gaudron. Marine, yes. So Marine is going to talk about the economic, social, and territorial cohesion and local finances during the pandemic. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So, yes. Oh. Right. So, thank you very much. I will speak about the work we've done in CMR and the experience we have with our members. Especially we'll focus on local finances, the impact of COVID on local finances. And at the end, I will say a few words about also cohesion policy. But first of all, if you're not familiar with the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, just small words of introduction. We are the oldest and broadest organization representing local and regional governments in Europe. So we cover 41 countries. So you see it's not just EU countries, actually it's the coverage of Council of Europe. And we have 60 associations, so the associations, they are national associations that represent local and regional governments in all their diversity, so municipalities, cities, counties, regions, departments, all you can have in terms of diversity of subnational governments in Europe. And in total, we can say we cover and represent 130,000 municipalities and regions. We have two main missions as CMR. The first one is targeted to influencing especially EU legislation. But the second one was particularly important during COVID, is that we are the place for a forum of exchanges and learning opportunities between the members. And during the COVID, they were really keen on having this place to exchange and know how municipalities and regions were coping and dealing with this situation in other countries. So that was really important at the time. So I will say a few words about this. So actually, we started working on COVID as early as we could. We set up a COVID task force in spring 2020, exactly to have these places for exchange of knowledge, and they were interesting to know how you dealing with the closure of schools and kindergarten in your countries, how you ensuring how municipalities are actually implementing the lockdown measures and so on. So very practical exchanges that took place. Also from CMA, we organized, we sent them a lot of surveys during this period to understand the impact of local finances. Also a bit later to understand how they were organizing local economic recovery strategies, how they were organizing a reopening of public services. We also tried to understand how the multi-level decision making process took place during this specific period. And also, at later stage, and actually quite recently, we teamed up with the Committee of the Region to understand how local and regional government associations, so representation, have been involved in the drafting of the RRF plans. And our conclusion was that not so much. So from all this knowledge we try to draw some conclusions or key messages. There is no magic answer. Obviously, we could just try to see and to observe what kind of policy making has been adopted in different countries. There is no one system or territorial system that was more efficient than others. But what we could see is that where you had a real coordination, really exchange between the national level and the local level, then the measures were more efficient. So really into the multi-level decision making was really at the moment critical to achieve results. So we have this discussion within CMA, but not only within CMA, we also exchange with OECD, with the Council of Europe, the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, and more recently we also teamed with ESPON for a project on territorial impact of COVID-19. So that's what we're talking about here. But I wanted to mention the publication that you see in the corner. That's the Terry report that we published actually end of last year. This is a publication we do regularly. The former title was Structure and Competence. And this is a publication where we explain for each country that we cover, so all European countries, 40 countries, what are the structures and competencies of the different subnational governments. It's really useful tool if you want to know who has the competency on health, transport, whatever. You can find this in this publication. And for this year, we really focus on health competencies also. And that's where you will see in this publication, if you have a look, health is a shared competencies. So usually it's the national governments who take the decisions, but we have seen that in the recent years there have been more and more decentralization trends, including in the health sector. So more and more the local governments are actually the ones who are charged to implement health measures and health policies. And also local governments have a lot of other competencies that were critical at the moment of COVID. They're responsible of social health care, elderly care, public safety and order, the school, primary and secondary, transport, culture, parks and recreation. So all of these sectors we could see have been impacted during COVID. Yes, can switch. This slide is just for me to make a transition to the local finances, because in the Terry report that I just mentioned, we also have a chapter dedicated to local finances, and here you will see some figures and data. Basically, it's a bit more complex than that in reality. This is a bit a simplification. But overall, we can say on average in the EU, the local governments, the state allocation part of revenue of local governments is about 71% 12.7% for all these countries. And the revenue from taxation is about 15.3% for all countries. Obviously, the picture is quite diverse. And also, this is for me a teasing, because at the end of this year, we will release a publication on local finances trends and evolution, and you will have much more detailed analysis on this kind of information. That leads me to the more concrete work we've done on assessing the impact of COVID on local finances. We've done 2 surveys, one in 2020 and the other one was released end of 2021. Obviously, they are not also my methodological caveats. Here we are at ESPON. This was not exactly academic work. It was more surveys to the members who could answer. So it was more for us to have an idea, and especially in the first years, we really try to understand, have an idea of, okay, what was the consequences, what was the first impact, but we need we certainly need more data and more studies to have concrete figures on this. So what I will present to you is not concrete data and figures, but more estimations and to give you some ideas. Basically, what these studies have shown, and it was demonstrated also by later publication, is we confirm the scissor effect. The scissor effect is that local and regional governments, they have to spend more during this time. They have to spend more in social care measures, implementing all the lockdown and safety measures, control of mask wearing, whatever you have. So this was additional cost, and at the same time they received less revenues because businesses were closed, income taxation was also lower because people receive less money. So this is exactly what we call the scissor effect. They spend more and receive less. So in this series of graphs, it will just basically illustrate this. This one is about additional sectoral expenses. Here we try to have also include the intermediary level, but I have to say it's maybe not exactly representative. So let's just look at local level and regional level. For the municipalities and cities, the sectors where they had more expenses was social care and support for vulnerable population. And also they spend quite some more compared to regular year on buying protective equipment for the staff under their responsibilities, and also all the cleaning and disinfection measures in public space, public transports and buildings. And for the regions were often tasked with the whole strategy of testing, tracing, vaccinating. So that was also quite additional expense they have to invest on, in addition to the other sectors in complementarity with municipalities. This one is about the revenue losses, and basically what I explained just before. So municipalities saw decrease in their revenue from local business taxes, from the fees they receive, the fees like for renting public spaces or other kind of services like transport and culture, and also obviously a loss in tourism taxes and hospitality taxes. Also, what we saw that, and I come back to this in the other slide, municipalities and regions, we also asked them how they have been supported by the national governments. But it's also important to know that some regions also try to support municipalities. So the support was from national, also to regional, also to local level. So here we have the kind of support measures that were put in place to compensate this other effect. So mostly from central government, it was additional transfers of resources. But also in some countries, national governments covered extra expenses like for purchasing of masks and protective equipment. And they were also trying to cover some additional healthcare related expenses. we have other types of support that are more rare, but in some countries there were additional liquidity or administrative flexibility, so like extension of deadlines for payments of municipalities and so on. And then there was a graphic you see on top, right? Is we ask the question to the national associations, how did you feel about this support? That was in 2021. And most of respondents said, yes, there have been some support from the central government, but it is not yet enough to cover the Salazar effect and the loss they are facing. So there are quite hopes, high hopes from local governments on the RRF. And here we asked them, so what do you think would be the most important for the RRF to finance? What is positive is that it's exactly the sectors that the Commission has identified, so green and digital transition. But still the RRF is only until 2023, and even before COVID there was quite a gap in local and regional investments. So in this situation, actually we're quite worrying about the long term and the capacities for local and regional to keep investing for long-term and sustainable development. And with this, I arrived to my final slides. With the RRF, I try to transition to cohesion policy and how it evolved. We touched a bit upon this morning. Here we see opportunities as well as risks. In the opportunities, of course, there have been more flexibility and the 100% co-financing. It's kind of things that we've been asking for some times. And here in the crisis, we saw interesting developments that we hope we will keep for the future of cohesion policy. Also, it's opening up the debate exactly on EU economic governance framework. I was saying that investment is, we have an local and regional investment gap in Europe. The investment for local and regional governments is also constrained by those EU budgetary rules. So if we have an evolution on these rules, we can hope to unlock some investments also at local and regional level. But we also see some risks. They were mentioned this morning. So the sort of re-centralization, renationalization of EU policies, funds and programs with the RRF. As I was saying, our surveys shows that local and regional governments were not so much involved in the drafting of the program, so that's, we hope we will learn from the lessons from this experience in the future. And yeah, I'm done with my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marine. And now I leave the floor for the last but not least presentation of Pietro from Eurocities.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm the only one without slides, so it's going to be a presentation without slides. Yes, maybe from the point of view of Eurocities, I guess you're familiar with Eurocities. It's a network of major cities. We represent more than 200 cities all over Europe. And let's say I can react to what was presented today from this observatory, where we have access, of course, to all city administrations, mayors, and as a CMR, of course, our network was very, very active from the beginning in terms of trying to provide a platform for exchange on how policies related to COVID were developed, and hopefully, I think. Already this platform work and this knowledge exchange, I think it's one policy learning in itself, and I think it comes also from the work of the ESPON study that, let's say, there is a window of opportunity to kind of work more systematically in terms of cooperating between cities, regions, subnational level governments to react to this crisis and to build policies based on evidence. I think this is probably one of the first huge crises that we will face, and it's important to be be able to react and build policy responses quickly. And I think this is quite important, the work of networks like Eurocities, CMAs, but also ESPON in kind of quickly assessing, giving this opportunity to exchange and build policies based on evidence. And this is quite important. I think this was incredible experiment that we could see different cities learning from each other on policies that really had an impact on the lives of people. So this is maybe the broader learning from the point of view of cities. So it is about working, also exchanging knowledge, and so COVID as an opportunity to kind of strengthen these cooperation aspects. But then when we go more into the details and also on what we can learn from an urban perspective when we talk about COVID, I think it's probably obvious, but one major takeaway that very often we discuss with our members is that planning matters, strategic planning matters, and it seems obvious from an urban perspective, but I think we are now very much more aware of the importance of strategic planning, and it was very crucial. I think the way cities were planned and built was crucial, both to slow the spread of the virus, but also to kind of react to the responses that had to, and the policies responses that had to be put in place as a result of the pandemic. So planning, I think cities are learning about the power of planning, and we have seen a lot of effort in terms of building open spaces, in terms of building access to housing, also moving to quality density. And I think the report says that, and it's a good point, it's the density, of course, it's related a bit with how the pandemic spread, but it's not, let's say, a particular determinant. And this is a key point because if we want to build resilient cities, we know that we need to tackle the climate challenges, and we need to build compact cities with good density. And so I think planning matters. This is a key learning that I think both in the short term was taken into account by city planners to kind of react to the spread of the virus, but also to build solutions that in the long term will allow to respond to this crisis. Another key learning, I think it's connected to planning, and I think it's connected with the whole theme of today's kind of the socio-economic effects of COVID-19. And we know that, unfortunately, COVID didn't eat everyone equally. And I would dare to say that the benefits of good urban planning are not spread equally. And this is a key learning that we see that, of course, certain neighborhoods were more affected, certain socio-economic groups were more affected, and I think also cities were quite aware of this point, and as it was shown before, a lot of their efforts were on social policies, also in kind of helping the most vulnerable that were affected. So there was already in the short term this effort to kind of build good solutions and spread the benefits of planning in that sense. But more in the long term, and what we see a lot in the local recovery plans, a lot of effort on housing, a lot of effort on open spaces, a lot of effort on improving the quality of the built environment, which is crucial. It's a crucial point that I think many cities are learning from COVID, that it is necessary to work on this. And of course, cities cannot do this alone, and the pandemic was an opportunity also to see how coordination between levels of governments is crucial, and how it can make a difference, both in terms of responding to a pandemic, but also building policy solutions that will improve the quality of life in this emergency context. And we have seen that governments, member states, countries that have a better functioning multi-level governance were able to build policy responses that were more effective, but we've also seen that maybe responding, for instance, in the case of cities, using also metropolitan areas governance and also working with the surrounding municipalities around mobility provided opportunities also to react in an effective way. And governance, it's a key point, but it's also I think it connects also with the ability then of the local government to respond. We have seen that different starting places of different governments had an impact. So the capacity to react was quite important, and also the capacity to work across departments to build this response. And as we want to build more resilient cities, more resilient governance, we need to make sure that city governments have the capabilities to respond quickly, to work across departments and with different levels of government to build the policy solutions. And maybe some last few points, because when we look at the socio-economic effects of COVID and we look at lessons learned and what kind of window of opportunity that means for cities, we already said a lot about how, let's say, we need a more decentralized public system. And I think it touches very much on the future of the welfare state and the role that cities, local authorities can have in building a more resilient welfare state. And we have seen that, and I think the report shows that those countries where public health had been supported better, that had not been impacted by austerity policies, were more able to respond. So it's about building the preventive capacity and the capacity to react quickly to these shocks, and the welfare state at local level can really fill the gap. And fill the gap not just in terms of providing, because of course not all local authorities have the different instruments on health, but it's also a lot about providing information. It's about simple things. But one thing that we as cities, I think we've seen is also the impact that we can have on mental health and well-being. And this is a key, let's say, aspect, a key learning in terms of how do we build a welfare state for the future, starting from the local level. How can we leverage urban planning to increase the well-being, to increase mental health. And of course, COVID really showed the importance of public spaces, of coming up together, of having access to green spaces and all these things. So there is an understanding at local level of a need to kind of build the local social infrastructure that will enable a better quality of life for everyone. And I think accessibility is a key point. And social infrastructures are also about housing, of course. And housing, we know that many cities are living through an housing crisis, and this is a strong determinant for well-being. So a lot of things. Maybe just also taking the inspiration from today's keynote from Mazzucato about also the power of the state in kind of giving purpose to the economy. Just one last point in terms of how can we learn from this pandemic, how can we build a more resilient economic system. It's also about finding a role also for local authorities in terms of providing boosting certain economic activities that have a purpose in society. And we've seen a lot of city centers that struggle, businesses, but they don't only offer economic services, but they also provide social services to the community. They are the glue of our community. So there is a role for governments to kind of support this in the long term, to have a role in supporting these economic systems and economic sectors. But of course, the cultural sector was strongly affected. So it's also one where the local government has a strong interest in having an impact. Now, this is a bit the situation, and how do we connect this with the European context and with the recovery plans? I think what Marine presented already about the lack of involvement of local authorities in the drafting of the recovery plans is very worrying. If we are start to build an inclusive recovery, we need to start from place-based policies, from the ground, where we know about the difference, where we can see the impact of different policies. They cannot be top-down, because I'm not sure the finance minister, as it was said today, will know about the impact of policies on different neighborhoods, and long-term, we really need this multi-level governance to work. And we have a huge window of opportunity. In Eurocities, we have really tracked also all the ambitious projects that cities have put forward, the strategies. There is a big momentum to kind of capitalize on the lessons of COVID, not just the lessons, but also on this new realization about the importance of planning and quality of life in cities. And there are many interesting frameworks, many interesting projects that have been put forward. So there is a strong need to support this. I think if we don't do it, we will not build the resilience that we need against future crises. One last point, because of course, we are living in a climate crisis. We know that there will be stronger effects on our cities, and these effects, these challenges will not be spread evenly, and there will be some more vulnerable people that will be more affected by this. I think the COVID pandemic can be a learning lesson to kind of make sense of this complexity, and providing policy solutions that look at the effects of policies on different social groups. Of course, with the climate crisis, climate solutions need to take this into account, and this will be the biggest challenge. I will stop here. I hope I was not too long.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have got just a few minutes, just a window of questions, for questions, if you have questions.
In this room, because otherwise we can continue the discussion downstairs.
Why not?
During lunch.
Why not? Okay.
Okay.
So, okay.
So, no questions at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.